As Yoda says, difficult to see the future is. But difficult is not impossible. Causes have effects, and the more you have a sense for the rhythms of the past, the better you can feel the future. For example, a few weeks ago, my 5-year-old knocked a metal plate off the counter in our kitchen. And as it fell, before it hit the ground, she put her hands over her ears. She knew from experience in the past that a metal plate hitting a tile floor is insanely loud. So she saw far enough into the future to take immediate action. And this is not prophecy or mysticism. This is just understanding the times, as the Bible would call it. Understanding causes and effects and understanding the culture. Like my 5-year-old and the sons of Issachar, we can glimpse the future, understanding the times enough to take action now to prepare. And this is particularly important for authors because it takes, for many of us, years to write a book. And you owe it to yourself to ask the question, what kinds of books will be popular in 2 years? What kinds of books will be popular in 5 years? Are you writing an epic series? Is this kind of story going to resonate with readers in the future? Well, it depends. Reader preferences change over time, and sometimes they change very quickly. And if you don't keep up, you can get stuck writing a book that no one wants to read anymore. So how can you tell what will be popular in a few years? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest-running book marketing podcast in the world. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast if you want new marketing tips and tricks every week. And if you're watching on YouTube, we'd love it if you gave us a like. Joining us to help us with the rhythms of history is author, publisher, game designer, and polymath, Alexander Macris. Welcome to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And you're from the games industry. And one of the interesting things when we're talking about Zeitgeist, right, which is the kind of spirit of the age or the defining mood of a time, is that it has been particularly underlined in games right now, I think more than in any other genre. So just in the last 9 months or 10 months, we have had 3 of the biggest flops ever in video gaming, right? So we had Concord, which lost $200 to $400 million, Skull and Bones, which lost $200 to $600 million, and Suicide Kill the Justice League, which lost another $200 million. That's over $1 billion in just 10 months in just 3 games. That's enough money to build over 4,000 homes. That's enough money to build 10 hospitals, and it just went poof, up in smoke. Games that probably would have done well if they were released 4 or 5 years earlier, but by the time the game came out, the zeitgeist had changed. And it's not just happening in video games, it's happening in Hollywood, right? Hollywood has seen it so much they have a new term, flopbuster, right? Indiana Jones lost $200 million, flopbuster. The Marvels lost tens of millions of dollars, flopbuster. And as we're recording this, the Joker 2 just came out, and it may be the biggest flopbuster of them all. And of course, it's happening with books. Publishers are better at hiding the specific failures. But if you look at where they're making their money right now, most big publishers are making most of their money from their classics, from their backlist, not from the new books, because we've just gone through a major shift in culture. We've gone from the 3rd turning to the 4th turning, if you follow the Strauss and Howe model. So I guess before we can get into the details for authors, let me explain Strauss and Howe's model. A lot of background in this episode, but there's this view amongst anthropologists, which is called the secular cycle or the seculum, where you have these 4 turnings that culture goes through. You have the first turning, which is a high. Each one of these are roughly 20 years or roughly 1 generation. The second one is an awakening. Then you have the 3rd turning, which is an unraveling. That's what we're leaving. The unraveling is a period of weakened institutions and rising individualism. Society starts to fragment, right? We start to feel more distrust for those around us, more distrust for authority, and skepticism towards established norms, right? You probably felt this. I've definitely felt this. It's more likely to have political gridlock, culture wars, economic disparity, etc. So this is the autumn. The seculum follows the seasons is a good metaphor for them. So the 4th turning is known as the crisis. It's the societal winter where things are dark and cold, but each day is actually longer than the day before. So this is what's interesting about seasons. The winter starts with the solstice, which is the very darkest day of the year. So every day of winter, you actually have more sunlight than the preceding day, even though it's bitterly cold. And the last fourth turnings, the last 5, 2 were revolutions, 1 was a civil war, and 1 was a world war. Right. So the last fourth turning was World War II. Then you had the Civil War before that. Then you had the American Revolutionary War before that. And then you had the Glorious Revolution. And then you had the Armada Crisis. And then finally the English Civil War. I feel like we're all still living in a world defined by the English Civil War. The American Civil War was the descendants of the same factions that fought in the English Civil War.
The numbers speak for themselves. You go 2024, you go back 80 years, it's 1944. You go back 80 years, you're in 1864, at the height of the Civil War. You go back to 80 years, you're in 1784, and it's the constitutional crisis after the American Revolution. But of course, these are 20-year periods. So we're sort of like right in the middle of it. And I think that's why we all have this feeling every single day. We're waiting for the shoe to drop. Like, I wake up every single morning, I turn on my computer, I look at X, and I'm like, is today the day the Third World War started? Or whatever, right? Something.
Yeah, I voted today. I went and did early voting. And normally people are kind of chatting and in a good mood, right? There's studies that find that voting makes people feel good. But this time there was a lot of people just like staring off into the middle distance with this really intense look on their face. Very somber, very serious. A lot of people had pieces of paper in their hands they had already decided who they were going to vote for. And it was really fascinating. So this is very much like this fourth turning kind of crisis era. And what the crisis is impossible to predict. I think historians looking back will definitely include COVID, the pandemic, as a part of the crisis. Kind of like in the last fourth turning, it wasn't just the World War, it was also the Depression. So it was the combination of those crises. So we don't know what the next crisis is. Obviously, we don't know who's going to be the president of the United States. We're recording this before the election. And I will say, of these crises, the Armada crisis / the gunpowder plot was not a revolutionary war, and it wasn't a civil war. Elizabeth was able to navigate very treacherous waters in a better way. And we can't predict specifics. It's kind of like psychohistory, where we can kind of sense the times, but we don't necessarily know what individuals will do. But it's very useful to get a sense of the times when you're trying to write a book that is connecting with where people are. So hopefully that's enough background. If y'all want to learn more about this, we didn't come up with this. Anthropologists have been studying this for a long time. The term seculum goes back to the Romans who are tracking this. You know, King Solomon alludes to it in the book of Ecclesiastes if you want to read that. But 2 books I would recommend. One is The Fourth Turning is Here, which I'll link to in the show notes. And the other one is the book Pendulum, which right now only the audiobook is available. But that book is really good, and that's specifically for marketers. It's using that same concept, but it's a little bit simplified. And it's very interesting because a lot of these books, Pendulum in particular, is predicting a lot of things that are happening right now. And it was written over a decade ago. But it was able to do it by getting a sense for the rhythms. So what do you see as the source of the flop buster? Right? Why are these games failing so spectacularly where they can't find any audience at all? When obviously the executives thought there was going to be millions and millions of people wanting to pay $40, $60 to buy these games, read these books, or watch these movies.
Okay, so my take on it is this. Most of the flop busters are what we might call progressive in spirit. And the creators are progressive. And to be progressive is to believe in what used to be called the Whig school of history, in which everything just keeps getting better and better and better. The wheel of history grinds slowly, but it grinds forward. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you are a progressive and you look at the state of a culture war as you enter it circa, say, 2012 with Obama era, et cetera, then by definition, as a progressive, as a Whig historian, theorist, you expect that there will be the continued triumph of progressive values. You know, today we have gay marriage, then we have support for transgenders and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We continue to get more progressive. But that's not actually what happened. We actually are experiencing, as you said, a cyclical history, right? Where things are not continuing as they were, they're rather entering into a crisis. And so what you basically see is a trajectory that they expect it to be going up, 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 is rather hitting a steep downward slope, and the flopbuster is the gap between the curve they thought they were on and the actual arc of history.
Yeah, according to pendulum theory, the pendulum hit its apex in 2023, or at least that's when they predicted the apex would be, which means that according to pendulum theory, we've already started a downward turn. This is going back to Strauss and Howe. This is the fourth turning rather than the third turning. And so they were expecting that pendulum to just go up forever, when in reality it changed directions. Now, changing directions doesn't mean that it's already over to the other end, right? It just means that the momentum has shifted. And I want to talk about some specific tropes and some things that I think that are going to change in what readers are wanting. And I think the first one I want to talk about is protagonists and what people look for in a hero, or whether they look for in a hero or not. So the third turning loved the anti-hero, the complicated hero, the hero with a dark past who is struggling with himself. And as we move into the fourth turning, and especially as we shift over into the first turning, that kind of hero is going to appeal less and less. And we see this again 80 years ago. What was really popular in the early part of the fourth turning? Noir, right? That smoky private detective.
Right.
Who didn't necessarily do the right thing because he wanted to. He wasn't a good man, but sometimes he did good things, sometimes he did bad things. And you had that fighting against, say, Agatha Christie, who ascended, right? So you had the smoky noir detective descending, and you had an Agatha Christie Hercule Poirot ascending, right? So Hercule Poirot is growing in popularity, while what's a good example of a noir detective?
Sam Slade.
Sam Slade is declining, right? And it didn't happen overnight, right? It's not like overnight people change, but overnight people change enough where if you spent $200 million making a movie, maybe you're not getting quite all that money back.
Right.
But the same with writing a book. The darker things are in real life, the more people long for heroes, and for heroes who are willing to sacrifice, right? So the anti-hero does the right thing for selfish reasons. The true hero does the right thing for selfless reasons. It's the difference between Batman and Superman, right? When one is waxing, the other is waning. Because sometimes Superman is more appealing and sometimes Batman is more appealing.
Absolutely. Right. I love that, by the way. The anti-hero does the right thing for selfish reasons, and the true hero does for selfless reasons. Fantastic. And the first people that come to mind, obviously, it's Batman and Superman. They are the anti-hero and the hero of contemporary culture. Although how much resonance they have with the younger generation, perhaps that's arguable. But certainly for our generation, those were the two tent poles.
Or Captain America and Iron Man may be better examples. So Captain America is the man who will dive on the grenade, whereas Iron Man is struggling with doing the right thing for selfish reasons, right? But which is resonant and with whom it's resonant is also really interesting, because as society shifts, people are shifting at different paces, and not everyone gets it, right? It's not like everyone's different, but the minority view and the minority view often will flip. For instance, The Sopranos came out in 1999, right? Classic anti-hero and the kind of story that would do really well in a third turning era. I don't think The Sopranos would do well today. If that show came out today, I don't think it would do as well. People aren't going back and rewatching The Sopranos like they used to.
Breaking Bad would be another example. Third turning.
So very noir, right? It's like, is this a good guy or is it bad guys? Well, he's a protagonist, right? And even the way we talk about fiction, protagonist and antagonist, it used to be, this was taught as hero and villain, because it was just assumed in the 1970s that the protagonist was the hero and the antagonist was the villain. It was like baked into the cake. And for our children, it will be baked into the cake again.
Yes.
We're going to get back there. Another way to think of it is relatable heroes as opposed to aspirational heroes.
Yes. That's a term I've used a lot. Affirmational heroes and aspirational heroes is how I call them.
So what's the difference between an aspirational hero and an affirmational hero?
So an aspirational hero is the hero you are not, but you wish you could be, or that you admire for who he is. The affirmational hero is the person just like you who, because of circumstances, has become a protagonist. And there's this great line in Neil Stephenson's book where he says, if only my parents had been killed when I was 7 years old, I know I could have been the baddest man alive, right? It's hero protagonist is like having this thought, right? And that's the affirmational protagonist. So he's a normal guy, but his wife gets killed, and so then he becomes the vigilante or whatnot.
Yeah. And we see the same thing mirrored in the villains.
Yes.
Right? So when you have an anti-hero, you often have an anti-hero villain. And I have this new term I would like to submit to the lexicon of authors. The Terminator to Thanos continuum.
Okay, I love it.
So Terminator, in the original Terminator, the T-1000, is a pure force of evil. All he does is kill and destroy. You don't reason with him, you don't talk to him, you don't let him touch you because he's just going to kill you, right? There's no complexity to the T-1000 as a villain. Whereas Thanos is the hero of his own story. He's the protagonist of the first of the Avengers films, and he is doing the right thing in his own mind. He's just wrong about what the right thing is. And he has experienced trauma, right? So it's the trauma of his past. It's causing him to do bad things in the present. And in pleasant times, that kind of villain is very satisfying. But in difficult times, you want to see the bad guy just get crushed.
Yes.
So going to video games, what are the two video games that are just crushing it right now in sales? They're video games with unambiguously evil villains, right? You have Helldivers 2, where you're shooting alien bugs that are killing humans, and you have Space Marines 2, where you're doing the exact same thing.
Yes,
These games basically have the same villain, but there's no complexity to the villains, right? On the Terminator to Thanos continuum, these are all the way back at the T-1000, which was a villain from the 1980s. And you saw a lot of these kinds of villains in the 1980s. The Alien film had the same kind of villain. These like non-complicated villains that are purely evil, that when they finally get defeated in the end, it's very emotionally satisfying. It gives me hope that sort of good conquesting over evil is possible in the future.
So my own role-playing game, Adventure Conquer King System, has taken fire because the beastmen and the monsters in Acts are innately evil. But my sense is you want to have innately evil antagonists. The adventurers need something that they can strive against and feel heroic about defeating. And that's been just absent for about a generation now in terms of villains. You know, it got to the point, the height of it to me was when the Star Wars franchise started to brag about the racial diversity and sexual diversity of the stormtroopers and the Grand Moffs. Like, you know, this is a genocidal empire that destroyed billions with the Death Star, but hooray, they're diverse.
Yeah, I suspect the apotheosis of postmodern storytelling happened with the Joker 2, because it's an anti-hero deconstructed in a subversive way. It is all of the things. Right. It is all of the boxes checked for postmodern storytelling. And everyone knew that. It was very obvious in the trailers. This is a deconstruction and it's subversive. And people are like, I'm tired of that. I would have enjoyed it. And I did enjoy it. Right? I'm not talking about me personally, but like people enjoyed the first Joker film, right? And it was a lot of those things. It wasn't quite so much as the Joker 2, but now people looked at it and they're like, ugh, I don't want to see that. And the people who did see it didn't like it. It got a D cinema score, which is staggeringly bad. Movies never get a D cinema score. Movies with $100 million budgets don't get a D cinema score, and movies with $200 million budgets never get a D cinema score. That is really, really bad. And why it is, by the time you're listening to this, you're like, oh, the Joker 2, that's right, it came out, right? Like, it's not a big blockbuster that everyone's talking about. It was a flopbuster that flopped really bad, maybe the biggest flop of all time, time will tell.
That's a high standard.
Let's talk a little bit about that subversion, right? So postmodernism was gaining in popularity in storytelling. And Brandon Sanderson has a really great essay that he wrote about 15 years ago about why he stopped writing postmodern fantasy. And his early books, his Mistborn stories, were postmodern and they were subversive. And he was like, this made them easy to pitch to publishers because it's what publishers wanted. But it doesn't make stories that appeal to readers. Readers feel betrayed with that subversion. Yes. And the readers who want the subversion often won't stick around for the normal bits before the subversion at the end, right? It's like we don't want our expectations subverted. We want our expectations delivered, especially in difficult times. When there's chaos around us, we don't want chaos in our storytelling. When there's tranquility around us, we have a higher appetite for chaos in our storytelling. And so as the chaos of this fourth turning expands, there's going to be a greater longing for simpler, more direct, more earnest stories that are less cynical and ironic.
Right. That's right. That's right. And we're going to see a lot of stories where a powerful figure arrives to make things right by force and virtue. So I started writing a TV show. I pitched it during the third turning, but maybe I should repitch it because it's about Aurelian Restitutor Orbis, right? Who was the Roman emperor who, when he took power, the empire shattered into the Gallic Empire, the Palmyran Empire, and then the rump of the Roman Empire, with itself split in two between the Senate and the emperor. And this one man rebuilds the entire empire. He in turn systematically defeats everyone and restores it. And that was why they called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. And he's largely forgotten today because he got overshadowed by emperors that came after him that led into the collapse. But he basically halts the crisis of the 3rd century. And I think that that's the heroic figure of the zeitgeist of the moment. Everyone can see that there are problems, but no one wants to hear about how the problems are unsolvable and you should just look out for yourself. People want to see, here's the problems, and here is the hero who rises to the occasion to solve those problems. That, to me, is, I think, the moment. Yes,
and there's 2 fictional characters that wax and wane with this seculum, and they are Robin Hood and King Arthur. Mm-hmm. And historically, King Arthur has been very popular during this 4th turning, and Robin Hood is more popular during the 2nd turning. What's interesting is there's been no popular Arthurian stories published recently, and I think there's a real opportunity here for a true Arthur story without the cynicism, without the irony, where Arthur, as a powerful man, unites the powerful knights, puts them in a round table, and together they fight evil, right?
Yes.
So you're focusing on the Arthurian story, not on the Lancelot story, not on the betrayal and the cheating and the adultery, but you're focusing on Arthur uniting the kingdom and saving them from the barbarians. So that story of a powerful, morally good leader is, I think, going to be resonant. And I saw somebody on X talk about this. Like, I want to see a story about the captain of the football squad, who's the protagonist, and he's good, and he's dating the leader of the cheerleading squad, and the bad guy is the one doing magic, who's the loner kid, right? It's like reversing. Because what's the story that everyone's been telling, the YA story, right? It's about the loner kid who does magic, and the captain of the football squad is evil, right? And it's like, we're tired of that. We've had that story. It's time for a different story where we feel like the problems that we face as a society, as individuals, are greater than ourselves. And we need powerful leaders, and we need to be powerful people who work together, right? Lancelot alone is not enough, but with Sir Galahad and the others, perhaps he is. Right. And if we put our swords together and we put our hearts together, that we can defeat this common evil that we face. And those kinds of stories, I think, are going to start being popular. But again, this is a decades-long process, so it doesn't mean they're going to be popular overnight.
You know, what's interesting is that the Arthurian cycle itself was written over many, many decades or centuries. And so you can actually trace all 4 turnings in the Arthurian mythos itself, right? So you have the 4th turning is King Arthur pulls the sword from the stone. He goes forth, he gathers the Knights of the Round Table, he restores peace to Great Britain. Then you have the section when Camelot reigns, and the knights are just kind of like traipsing around the enchanted forest, and they're fighting some giants, and they're saving some damsels, but it's basically all good times. Right. You know, they're just kind of arguing over who's the greatest knight, right? And that's your 2nd turning. You know, then you get into the 3rd turning, and Lancelot is hooking up with Guinevere, and Mordred is causing problems, and Morgan Le Fay is being seductive and showing up in like a chainmail bikini. And then you get into the 4th tier, And it's like King Arthur rises to the occasion. He puts the band back together. Lancelot comes out of retirement. All is forgiven. They team up. Galahad finds the Grail, and they defeat Mordred, right? Like, it's all there.
And Arthur dies.
And Arthur dies, right.
Yeah.
But he goes to Avalon, and he's going to be back the next fourth turning, right? Yeah. It's all there. It's all there.
It's interesting because there's a American version of Arthur that they actually talk about in the book, The Fourth Turning is Here, called The Grey
Champion.
The Grey Champion, yes. And it was a story by Nathaniel Hale, I believe. He wrote it in the 1830s. But the Great Champion came back in 2 fourth turnings, the Revolutionary War and then the one before that, the Glorious Revolution, the American side of the Glorious Revolution. And the idea, and I think this is a great idea. I pitched this to my brother, but I'll pitch this to all of you listening. I think a story of the Great Champion could be a really great story for today, right? He came back in the Civil War. He came back and fought with the Allies. Like, he was there in the mists on Normandy, and he's here now with our current crisis. The Great Champion has returned. And actually, Robert E. Howard had a character based off of the Great Champion. His other stories, Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane arguably is based off of the Great Champion. So I encourage you, if you're curious about this, go back, read the short story for the Great Champion. It's in the public domain, which means Nathaniel Hale's long dead. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
You can bring the Great Champion back and put him in the current crisis, whatever the current crisis. Because we're recording this and we don't know what the crisis is going to be. Right? We know that there's always been a crisis in this era of history, but we don't quite know what the crisis is going to be. And that's where you as an author can offer hope. And you can look back at what gave people hope in the past to guide your writing of fiction. Because it's interesting. There's a nostalgia that's a very interesting nostalgia that happens in the fourth turning. So nostalgia is universal.
Right.
But the nostalgia in the fourth turning tends to be for the last fourth turning. So what was the most popular film of the last fourth turning and the most popular book of the last fourth turning? Gone with the Wind, right? Most successful movie of all time, adjusted for inflation.
Yep.
What is Gone with the Wind about? It's about the previous fourth turning, the Civil War, right? Yep. So people are facing the Depression. They're looking forward. There's storm clouds of war brewing in Europe. Maybe the European powers will go to war. If people feel very uncomfortable and uncertain. Is there going to be another world war? Was the Great War not enough? Right. This is the context of 1934 when Gone with the Wind comes out, and they're looking back with nostalgia to a really awful time. Right? Like, who's nostalgic for all of our sons being killed in this terribly bloody war? But they were at that time. And what's interesting, what are we nostalgic for right now? World War II. It's the last fourth turning, right? Yep. World War II stuff is selling like crazy. World War II movies are popular, but World War II books are even more popular, and people are thinking about World War II quite a bit.
They are. The other thing, and this is many turnings ago, but you see it all over on the internet, is the fall of Rome, right? Yep. Or actually, I should say, it isn't so much the fall of Rome that really captures people's imagination right now. It's the fall of the Roman Republic.
Exactly. And it's not the fall of the empire.
Right. It's the fall of the Republic and the rise of Caesar and Augustus and Trajan, etc. That's a vibe I've been tapping into in my own work personally. Now I'm thinking maybe I should do a World War II game or comic, right?
It's a very appealing era. And once you know what to look for, you'd be surprised how many things are quietly based off of World War II. So StarCraft is based off of World War II, right? What are the 3 factions in StarCraft? Well, you have the Zerg. It's obviously the Soviets. You have the Protoss, which is obviously the Germans. And then you have the Terrans, who are the Americans. Right? And if you know anything about military technology in those video games, you totally get that reference. And for everyone else, we'll move on to the next thing. So one of the interesting themes of this fourth turning is the relationship between the individual and society.
Yes.
Which is shifting, right? So in the crisis, there is this call to everyone to die to themselves and sacrifice themselves for the greater good. All right. Give your sons to the war, right? Mars demands sacrifice, and he only accepts the young and the healthy, right? We don't send our sick and our old to war. We send our young and our healthy to war. Mars must be propitiated, to put it in the ancient Roman language. Mars is the god of war. Y'all don't know. And so some books that were popular in the 1930s, 1940s, one was The Grapes of Wrath, and the other one was Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And what's interesting is that both of these books are talking about that individual versus society relationship, and yet they're offering entirely different answers. And so So like, how does that speak to the zeitgeist? It's like, well, it talks about what the conversation was that was interesting, not what the answer was, right? Your answer may be different, but they were talking about things that were of the current moment, questions that people were asking, and they were answering those questions with fiction, right? And Fountainhead, there's some speeches in there that border on nonfiction, but it's a novel still, technically.
Yeah. Well, and also if you think about it, during the 1930s and the 1940s, is really the rise of both fascism and communism, both making the call to put aside your individual selfishness and give yourself over to the state if you're an Italian fascist, to the race if you're a National Socialist, or to the class solidarity if you're a communist.
Yeah, workers of the world unite.
Workers of the world unite, restore the Roman Empire as Mussolini wanted to do. It was the exact same message. And in the U.S., we found our answer to it as well with Uncle Sam Needs You. I think part of the reason for the emphasis on nostalgia towards the Civil War during the 1940s and the 1930s is the emphasis on the need for unity, right? Because you don't just come out of the Civil War and you hate each other. You come out of the Civil War and you're all Americans. And that was a really important message at that time, which we rejected in the third turning and started to tear down the memorials and say, no, those were traitors. Those were terrible people. Those were not real Americans.
Yeah, it's interesting because the result of the crisis of the fourth turning these last several hundred years has been kind of rejuvenated era. So I don't want to get too much into it, but the first turnings have really interesting names historically, right? We have Happy Days, right? The 1950s are this nostalgic time. We have the Gilded Era, if you go back before that. It was called the Era of Good Feelings. That's literally what everyone called it because everyone was getting along. They'd worked through their drama and there was this beautiful time. But you have to go through the winter in order to get to the spring. And speaking of winter and spring, one interesting genre that was particularly popular in the last fourth turning was true dystopian. So I'm not talking about cynical dystopian flavored stories like Divergent, right? Divergent, I would say, isn't a true dystopian book, even though it has a lot of dystopian elements. A true dystopian is what we saw in the last fourth turning. Brave New World, Animal Farm, 1984, Fahrenheit 451. These were all published within a few years of each other. And in a true dystopian, you take that utopian world that's being presented in the fourth turning, right? Because different leaders in different cultures will present different visions of here's how we get out of the crisis. Because we all know that there's a crisis, but we don't agree on what the glorious future is going to be. We don't agree on that. In a true dystopian, you take that utopian vision that's being sold by the leadership and you show how it's actually a dark, evil, twisted, terrible thing, right? So 1984 is critiquing fascism. Animal Farm is critiquing communism really articulately, right? It's like, this isn't really the beautiful world that you think that it is. It's actually a very dark and scary world where you've gotten rid of the humans, but now the pigs are just as bad as the humans and nothing has really changed.
Yep. And Brave New World didn't know it, but it more or less is criticizing technocratic neoliberalism, hedonistic materialist neoliberalism.
And we need good dystopians to be written in the next few years. Yes. We need these utopian views of the future critiqued from the inside.
That's
and
right.
The only way to effectively do that is with really good fiction. Everything in Animal Farm was written, all of those critiques you can take back to the sailors in like 1917, 1918. There was a group of sailors that like initially helped the Bolsheviks overthrow the czars, but they weren't the right kind of communists and they ended up getting pushed out, and they published some really great essays critiquing communism that were censored and suppressed and didn't affect the dialogue, and they lost and they're all gone. They all died. Yeah, they all died. But then they were celebrated. The Communist Party celebrated their early parts of helping the revolution and just ignored the part where they were like, wait a minute, the communists are just as bad as the czars. So the essay version of that existed 30 years before, but it wasn't until George Orwell fictionalized it that the idea was able to spread. And so the ideas for the really good dystopians, the ones that will be classics for generations, already exist in the essays if you know where to look.
That's right. That's right.
And if you read those essays and you write those stories, you could be the next George Orwell. You could be the next Adolf Huxley. This isn't our invitation for you, because every one of these utopian views of the future are flawed. Not to be too cynical, because cynicism's going away, right? We're about to enter a non-cynical time, but we know history enough to know that it's never quite as good as it looks.
That's right. Well, so two thoughts on there. So one, Ayn Rand also wrote a dystopia, which was semi-autobiographical, but it's her only book with a truly tragic ending. And personally, my favorite of her books. And then the other thing that I think is important to stress is that in Strauss-Howe fourth turning theory, the happy ending, the rejuvenation, is not guaranteed, right? So they stress every time so far the United States has emerged out of its fourth turning, rejuvenated, stronger, and better. But it isn't inevitable. And it's that possibility that it might go wrong each time is what makes the dystopia emotionally powerful, right? Because subconsciously we know, I think all of us, that things could go really, really wrong really, really easily. A simple mistake can lead to the Third World War and nuclear annihilation, or biopandemic, or market crashes from an AI. We don't even understand what it's doing anymore. Like, there's so many ways things could go wrong. There's no guarantee. So it's that balance between predicting the new golden age and predicting the iron age gets challenging.
And I just looked it up. We the Living came out in 1936, so it's right in this
there you go.
window of dystopian stories. We need that perspective, and we need novelists to give us that perspective, because you're exactly right. And if you start looking at fourth turnings that other countries go through, so Strauss and Howell's books are for American audiences predominantly. But if you look at the fourth turning that, say, Russia's gone through, their stories are way darker and sadder.
Yes,
right?
yes.
They've had some really, really rough fourth turnings, and extended ones. Because sometimes it's really short, sometimes it's really long. Like the Civil War fourth turning didn't go the full 20 years. It only went 5 because the war was surprisingly decisive. The civilization of the South was far more fragile than Southerners realized. All right, so war is a contest of civilizations, and while Southerners were good on the battlefield, they had built a very fragile civilization that was not able to withstand extended warfare in any sort of meaningful way. And after 5 years, the civilization was kaput. So the answer to that was very decisive. So we talked about dystopian. I want to free you all to start writing dystopian. This is your chance. I don't think dystopian will work in 20 years, and it didn't work 20 years ago, but I think now is your time. But it's not the only kind of story that will resonate. It's interesting, The Hobbit came out about 80 years ago. 1937 was The Hobbit. In that escapist literature, when people are in a crisis, they are looking for an escape. And it's very interesting because the tone of The Hobbit is very different from Lord of the Rings. The tone is much lighter, and the stakes are much lower, which makes it more of an escape. Right now, every fantasy story, the whole universe is at stake. Now, the multiverse it's not just your universe, it's all the universes. Like, we keep cranking up the tension, thinking it's going to actually make it more intense, and it actually has the opposite effect. Whereas this is I would argue, a chiastic story following the 2-act structure. The big cataclysm, the peripety, is Frodo finding the ring, where he goes from a passive participant to an active participant. He goes from a useless member of the band to a useful member of the band. Interestingly, it follows the Good Night Moon model, where the peripety is earlier on in the story rather than later on in the story. But people are longing for escape, and you have to understand what they're wanting escape from to be able to craft that really good escapist story.
And you see what they wanted the escape from at the time that Tolkien wrote in the idyllic view of English life that he presents, right? It avoids the ugly industrialization that was destroying the countryside at the time. You still have the well-mannered country shires. There's still mutual respect and affection between the social classes. There's no hint of communism and the labor movement tearing apart the shire. And when it does arrive in The Lord of the Rings, it's presented in a villainous manner, of course. You also see the camaraderie of the band of brothers going to war together, which I think reflects that World War I experience that had traumatized a lot of them. And it's all right there in this microcosm of the Shire and Middle-earth. And you have the wise leader, Gandalf, literally a gray champion, right?
Yeah.
It's all there in a really beautiful way that's accessible to children, right? But enjoyable by
Completely
adults.
devoid of cynicism.
Yes.
So compare The Hobbit to the noir of the 1920s and 1930s that was on the decline at this time. So they existed at the same time. The Big Sleep, I think, came out the same year as The Hobbit.
Right.
But there's an earnestness to The Hobbit that's refreshing and escapist. I want Gandalf to be good. I don't want Gandalf to be harboring a secret in his dark past. It's like, no, I just want him to do the right thing.
Yes.
Right? He can make mistakes, but I want him to be morally good. That moral clarity is the escape of The Hobbit. It's not the fact that dragons are real.
Right.
People who are not fans of fantasy realize it's not about the dragons.
That's right. I mean, in my own recent comic book, Star Spangled Squadron, there's a character, American Eagle, who gains his superpowers. They manifest while he's rescuing children as a firefighter from a burning school. He's a married Christian father of two who coaches Little League. And when his powers develop, he goes and loyally serves the U.S. government. And everybody's like, okay, what's the twist? I'm like, the plot twist is there's no plot twist. He's just a good dude who loves his family, loves his wife, and loves his country. And to my surprise, because I hadn't quite put my finger on it yet, but to my surprise, when I polled readers, he was the #1 most popular character in the book. And I had the sexy bad girl, I had the wisecracking, I had the anti-hero. They're all there, but it was just American Eagle's the guy that people loved.
Yeah, that subversion is becoming so wearying. I recently watched a music video that Saturday Night Live put out, and it was, the song was, I Love the Smell of My Best Friend's Home. And it was this really positive, optimistic song about how much this young woman enjoyed nostalgically the smell of her best friend's home and all the good feelings she had. I was like, man, this is such a nice song. It's so sincere. I was like, wait a minute. This is Saturday Night Live. This is a postmodern production. There's going to be a twist that's going to ruin all of this, right? There's going to be some subversion. And sure enough, the subversion halfway through the song, which followed the chiastic structure, was, turns out the dad, the white man, was a serial killer. And the smell of my best friend's home was all the dead bodies that were hidden around the house. And it was just like, so fatiguing. I'm so tired of the same thing every time. And it's become so common that I knew it was coming. I knew there was going to be a twist. And partly it's because I knew the worldview of the creators, and I knew that they don't have a hopeful worldview. They have a deconstructionistic worldview. And the thing is, we're running out of things to deconstruct. Disney very soon is going to run out of old classics to remake. They will have deconstructed all of their stories, and they're going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel. They've already deconstructed all of their popular films. Now they're having to go to their less popular films to deconstruct. And I really think that readers are just tired of postmodernism. They're tired of that subversion. There's a growing longing for sincerity. And in a crisis, readers are longing for hope. In books that offer hope, stories that offer hope, that there is a light, that there is good in this world worth fighting for, Mr. Frodo, right? That hope, that core moral message is really appealing. And the kind of nihilistic, everyone is bad, just searching for their own self-interest, Game of Thrones type story was very popular in the third turning. It's not going to be as popular in the fourth turning. Without some shifts, right? If HBO wants to continue making Game of Thrones stories, they're going to need to bring in some moral characters.
That's right. That's right. You know, and interestingly, we're actually seeing this shift not just in media and entertainment, but it's actually happening within philosophy as well. For over a generation, postmodernism has dominated philosophy, and it rejects the existence of objective fact, which means it rejects the existence of objective good and objective evil. It rejects the possibility of knowledge, right? And so it confines you to this nihilistic philosophy where everything is meaningless, nothing is knowable, and the only good is whatever benefits you at that moment. And that philosophical view is now being challenged by the next generation, which is actually bringing back like scholasticism with its view of there is a purpose and a meaning. Theism is making a comeback in the philosophical community to everyone's surprise, right? The age of the new atheists has ended. And I think it actually probably preceded this a little bit by about a decade, as is often the case. But I read a lot of philosophy, and I see it happen on my watch. And I've been trying to reflect that and incorporate that into my own world building, right? Like, if you're going to defend objective good, then there actually has to be objective good, right? Like, you yourself can't be undecided about who the heroes are in the story. They have to be justified. The innately evil guys really have to be evil, and there needs to be a reason why. And one of the most popular IPs of the moment among young men is Warhammer 40K, right? And there's this huge battle between, let's call it third turning and fourth turning enjoyment of Warhammer 40K, where the third turning says, no, it's all a satire. The God Emperor of mankind is actually a tyrant. The Space Marines are thugs, and humanity is the villain. And the fourth turning says, what are you talking about? The enemy wants to extinguish all human life. They're literal demons. The God Emperor symbolizes Jesus, and the Space Marines are the new Crusaders. And they fight about this all the time, about how to interpret it. And I'm going to guess from the success of Space Marine 2 that you brought up at the start of the show, that we're going to see that fourth turning Warhammer is going to be the one that wins in the current moment.
And what's interesting is that it's the same message, but in the third turning formulation of it, it's full of irony and cynicism.
Right.
And those people's children are hearing that message without the irony and without the cynicism. And they're like, let's go on a crusade. Let's crush the evil ones. It's like justice and good must prevail. Humanity must be continued. We are the descendants of the stars. And this planet is for Earth and for humanity, or for super Earth and managed democracy. Yes. Right now, where we are, we don't know what the cause is. But we need the cause.
But we need the cause. Yeah, and you see it in the way people talk about Elon Musk as the star prophet and how excited everyone got about his recent success with the rocket, right? And again, you have that third turning, fourth turning. Oh, Elon is just a grifter. His money comes from the government. No, we're never going to go to Mars. This is a pipe dream. And then the other people are saying, I support whatever political system is spaceships. That's my politics, right?
And it goes back to optimism. So we're talking about nostalgia for the past, but there's also a growing optimism for the future. So as society moves through the crisis, there is a realization that times are bad right now, but times can be better for my children. I can make the world better through sacrifice, through difficult action. Tough men are going to make good times, and my children are going to get to live in good times. And that I felt that. I watched this starship get caught. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope for the future, that maybe the future could be better than the past. Because the reality is, my generation is poorer than my parents' generation. And my parents' generation is poorer than their parents' generation. I could not afford to buy the house that I grew up in. And I don't think my dad could have afforded to buy the house that he grew up in, right? Like, we're slowly getting pushed out of Austin. So, right. And this is not unique to my family. This is a universal thing that's happening across society of like, gosh, I feel like we're falling backwards. I feel like we're not progressing as a family. And there's this beginning dawn of hope that happens in the fourth turning crisis, which goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning about the seasons. Right. It is the coldest, most miserable time, but it is the time when the days are growing longer. That hope is beginning to emerge, and readers are beginning to long for stories that start to show that hope. And I think this is something that Christian fiction really needs right now. So what's popular with Christian fiction right now is very nostalgic. It's very much looking back, right? It's bonnets and good times in the past. And there's not that optimism for the future. And I think that that's part of the reason why those bonnet stories maybe not quite doing as well as they were, is because they don't have that hope, that sense of hope that readers are beginning to long for. And so putting that hope in the future, that times won't always get worse. Income inequality doesn't always get worse. In fact, in fourth turnings, the crisis tends to be really felt the worst by those who are the most well off, right? Who got hurt the worst in the Great Depression? The people who own the most stocks, right? If you were already poor at the beginning of the Great Depression, you had nothing to lose.
Still poor. Right? Same thing in the Civil War in the South, right? Who lost the most? The plantation owners.
That's right. And in the Revolutionary War, John Hancock had a whole fleet of ships. He was a merchant king. And his whole fleet got sunk in front of him. Right? The cost for him of putting his signature on the Declaration of Independence was very high.
Very high.
And he was never as wealthy after the Revolution as he was before the Revolution. And so it's a kind of a societal reset in a way, or at least it has been. Again, hard to see the future is. But
great
we have
reset.
these eras where it's happened in the past. And so I would put this in another thing for perhaps in the escapism column of financial stability, right? The stories that where the characters are financially stable, maybe a nice break from a time when it's like, gosh, prices keep going up. My income's not going up to keep up with it, right? This house is getting more and more expensive. The taxes are getting higher. How are we going to make it? And you're reading a story where those are not points of pain, right? It's like, I have financial problems at home. I don't need to read a book about people with financial problems.
Right.
But I don't think that's universal. But I think especially for, I would say, science fiction, part of the appeal of true science fiction, not dystopian science fiction, is the prosperity. Right?
Yes.
Nobody on the Enterprise is poor.
And it's interesting as well, you think about how we are on the fourth turning thinking about this, but let's consider Fight Club or Office Space, where the problem that the young men in those movies had was that they had no problems, right? And so they have to go pick fights because they are materially well off. Office Space, oh, gee, he has an easy 9-to-5 job that pays him well and he's miserable. Then you get into that. It's almost like a second turning vibe, right? Like the desire to be the rebel. And then you get into the third turning, and the people today, like the younger generation, can't even imagine having a 9-to-5 job that pays them well enough, right? And so the fourth turning is going to be the story that takes for granted that you have a job and are stable, and then what great things do you do?
An interesting picture of this is The Simpsons. So The Simpsons, when it was first conceived, Homer Simpson is this loser, high school graduate. And as the years have gone on, Homer Simpson has changed how people see him. Because now my generation looks at him and is like, gosh, he's a high school graduate. He can support a family. His wife's able to stay at home. They can afford to go on vacation. It's like, this is this dream.
Yeah, he's an aspirational figure.
He's become an aspirational figure. How did Homer Simpson become aspirational? It's like, well, society's been unraveling. The social bonds have been unraveling. The economy has been unraveling. The social contract between the wealthy and the poor has been shifting. And so this character who hasn't changed, right? Homer Simpson, they've worked really hard to keep him steady. The way that he is read by readers or by viewers has changed. And this is, I think, a good illustration of how these turnings work. You can have the same story, but the cultural context that somebody's experiencing when they're reading that story, it hits different, right? Different parts of that story appeal differently. And a true classic will appeal to people at all points at all four turnings, right? The Hobbit wasn't just popular during the fourth turning. It was popular in all of the turnings. And that's actually one downside of the examples we shared when I was doing research. The books I could most easily speak to were books that were still popular, right? Ayn Rand is still being read. The Grapes of Wrath is still being read. And so in that way, it actually is not a good example. So if you're a literary agent really wanting to research this, go pull the bestseller lists from 80 years ago and look at the books that were popular then that have been forgotten, because those books, understanding why they were popular then, can give you insight in what will be popular today. So I'm going to go down my list, make sure I hit all of the things. Readers are longing for moral clarity. They're longing for true self-sacrificing heroes. They're longing for financial stability. They're longing for hope. And again, this is a growing longing. What else am I missing?
I just realized something. If I'm an executive at Marvel Studios and I'm listening to this podcast, I am going to find whose ever idea it was to kill off Captain America and have him retire. I'm going to have that writer taken out and shot, right? Because who is Captain America? He's literally the gray champion of the 1940s who beats Hitler. He gets frozen in time and he wakes up in the present day to be a patriotic hero. He is probably their most valuable IP for the zeitgeist of the moment, and they just literally retired him and brought in the new guy who's the third turning, cynic.
That was a financial mistake.
Yes.
But what's a mistake for Hollywood is an opportunity for authors. So
That's
Hollywood is floundering right now. They're really, really struggling to make films that resonate and to make films that are a consistent hit. And part of it is they've gotten to the end of their philosophy.
Yeah.
And eventually with deconstruction, there's nothing left to deconstruct.
Correct.
And they haven't been able to create new IP. They haven't been able to tell new stories. The new stories that they've been making, because they've been still making these films, but they've been flopping so atrociously that people aren't even noticing. They're just blowing right by. And it's only when you look at the financials and you're like, wait, Disney spent $100 million for that movie? Nobody watched it. And it's like, yeah, because they're not able to create new stories that resonate with new readers. And Hollywood's going to have a really rough time.
Yes.
The next few years are going to be rough for Hollywood. They'll have some hits, but I don't know if they're going to have a Helldivers or a Space Marine 2 that's going to save them, kind of keep the industry afloat like what has happened in video games. Maybe they will. But the only movie I'm looking forward to right now, or TV show, is the Daily Wire's Arthurian story with Brett Cooper. I'm kind of curious. I'm like, will they get Arthur right? Like, can somebody write a non-cynical, non-ironic, honest telling of Arthur? I would love to watch that story. I think we're going to need kind of a generational transition where a new generation of storytellers comes in who are more optimistic, less cynical, less ironic, who bring in heroes instead of anti-heroes, who are not wanting to subvert expectations but tell a straightforward story. And this is, I think, another thing that we see. One of the big criticisms of first turning and fourth turning storytelling is that it's very simplistic and it's very commercial, right? So the awakenings, and I don't want to get too much into the second turning and third turning, but each turning solves the problems of the previous turning and creates the problems that generate the next turning, right? That's why the wheel rolls round and round. And the complexity of storytelling tends to diminish, right? People in a crisis aren't looking for complicated, they're looking for simple. When you're starving, suddenly spam becomes appealing. When you're feasting, spam is disgusting. Spam has not changed. And how hungry you are and what you're hungry for changes over time. And we don't have all the answers, but I want you, as you're hearing us have this conversation, to start thinking of your story that you're writing and how you can make it more in sync with where readers are going to be. Because the principle here is to skate to where the puck is headed. Everyone's always trying to chase the puck. And if you ever watch kids playing hockey or kids playing soccer, when they're really little, there's the ball, and then there's a group of 3-year-olds all kind of chasing the ball around the field. But eventually you get old enough to realize, oh, chasing the ball is not the right strategy. The right strategy is to look at the ball, understand physics, and go to where the ball is going to be. If you watch professionals play soccer, they're all spread out, right? And they're running to where the ball is going to be, and often, several steps ahead. And you can learn to do that. You can be like the sons of Issachar, who know the times and know what needs to be done. Because once you understand the times, the obvious next step becomes obvious. It's the lack of understanding of the times that makes confusion and leads to foggy thinking.
I want to speak to something you said about how sort of the things get simpler, right? And I have this notion that complex solutions are a luxury good. So imagine you're constructing a dam, which is going to bring electrical power. And in the construction of the dam, however, you're going to disrupt the migration of a specific species of salmon. If you are a wealthy industrial powerhouse and all the dam is going to do is reduce the cost of energy by 5%, then the construction of the dam isn't what interests you. What interests you is how do you construct the dam in a way that's going to save the salmon? And you happily will pay the extra 5% to keep the salmon safe, right? On the other hand, if you have no electrical power at all, and this dam is going to mean you get to heat your house in the winter, right? Then you don't care about the salmon. You care about heating your house in the winter. But what I think is important here is that in that story, it's the construction of the dam itself. It's the very thing that's taken for granted in the wealthier time, in the more flourishing time, that in the chaotic time is the story. It's the construction of the dam is the story. And so, yes, it's simpler because you're not taking into account the salmon and the ecological impact, but there's also something grand and beautiful about it that's easy to overlook in a more cynical time.
What's interesting is that exact thing has happened just in the last few years. So Europe has a network of canals where you can move things by boat all throughout Europe. And the Volga River connects to that network of canals. But at the end of the Volga River, it's not deep enough so that ships from the Black Sea can easily enter the Volga River and go up. So you can't go through the Black Sea and enter to the North Sea very easily. They could dredge the Black Sea to the Volga River, but that would be ecologically devastating. And so because it was bad for the environment, it hasn't been done. Until now, they're doing it. Why? Because there's this big war happening with Russia, and the Black Sea is full of drones and boats and warships, and things are getting sunk. And so now the calculus has shifted, And the environmentalists aren't pushing back on this dredging of the Volga River like they were. And now, potentially for all of posterity, Ukraine will now be connected to the great European canal highway for getting goods throughout Europe if they finish the project. I don't think the project has been finished. But you're exactly right in that complex solutions are a luxury and complex stories are a luxury. And again, look at Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The Lord of the Rings came out in a first turning, and The Hobbit came out in a fourth turning. The Hobbit has a very simple story. It's very episodic. It lends itself really well to a chiastic structure when each chapter is its own short story in essence.
Right.
The Lord of the Rings, I don't think anybody has ever described The Lord of the Rings as a simple story.
Right.
Right. It's a very complicated story. It's the kind of story that would be more popular in more simpler times.
That's right. That's right. And The Lord of the Rings is the story that solidifies the founding myth, right? Like, it justifies the good king has restored order, and now you're moving into this good new age, right? Every turning has a story it tells itself which justifies its actions. And The Lord of the Rings is very much that story for post-World War II in many ways, right? We've confronted evil, we've been victorious, and now the good kings are in charge. So I guess if we really want to get ahead of the puck, we got to figure out what's going to happen in the fourth turning and then write that first turning book over the next 20 years like Tolkien.
I just read The Fourth Turning is Here. And each generation has a name. Mm-hmm. And going back, at least in the United States, each generation has a name. Each country tends to name its generations separately. And the names of the generations and of the eras often are picked by novelists and short story writers. Historically. So like the Gilded Age, that's from a Mark Twain short story criticizing that beautiful era after the fourth turning, the short fourth turning of the Civil War. So you had the Gilded Age where you had railroads and skyscrapers and like the nation getting formed and Manifest Destiny. Mark Twain's criticism was it looks golden, but really it's just gilded and it's not gold to its core. But you as an author just might, somebody listening to me talking about this episode, because not a lot of authors are familiar with this. Y'all are getting a head start by listening to this episode. You just might have a chance to name one of the unnamed generations. So my children's generation doesn't have a good name yet. Now, the fourth turning calls them the Homelanders, which I don't think is going to stick. Right now they're called Gen Z, and then there's Gen Alpha after that. With the exception of Gen X, poor Gen X was never able to get its own name. It just got stuck with the letter. All of the other generations eventually will get a name.
Right.
And you have an opportunity, potentially, if you can see culture, if you can be aware of the times, your short story, your novel, just might name the era or name the generation for all time for everyone. That's a cool opportunity that you have as a novelist.
Yes. Right now, it seems like they're being the Zoomers, which I guess is a play on boomer, but I don't know.
I remember when the millennials were called the Echo Boomers.
Echo Boomers, yeah.
So I feel like the boomers tried to stamp their name on all of the future generations, and all the future generations end up shrugging it off.
They're like, nah, brah. Yeah.
Alexander, do you have any final kind of thoughts on matching the zeitgeist and any encouragement for an author who's trying to navigate culture with their writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you should do is you should go back and look at what was doing best, right, in the last turning. And we can argue about the specific year. Some people say it was 1929 to 1949 or 1930 to 1950, but it's a defined era. You go back, you look at that, and you don't want to copy that, right? But you want to understand why it mattered, right? And then bring that into the present day. If you do want to copy something, though, copy World War II and do World War II nostalgia.
Yeah, I agree. Understanding why is the answer, right? You're not trying to retell the Murder on the Orient Express. That's not the answer. But understanding why the Murder on the Oriental Express did well. Why was Hercule Poirot such an appealing protagonist? Why him, of all of the Agatha Christie detectives, why was he so popular? And why did it shift over time, right? Once you understand the why, it can enable you, with understanding of the past, to be resonant in the present. Because There's nothing new under the sun. Do you see something that is new? Really, it is old. And that saying is really, really old. So Alexander Macris, thank you so much for joining us today. Alexander has an excellent Substack where he talks about culture that I would highly recommend. We'll link to it in the show notes. But for those of you who want to search and don't want to go to the show notes, what's the name of that Substack?
The Tree of Woe.
Which is a very third-turning name.
Very third-turning name. Yes.
May get a more optimistic name in a decade or so.
That's
we'll
right.
see.
That's right.
So you can check out Alexander Macris on the Tree of Woe, and we'll have links to all of his other stuff there in the show notes for this episode at authormedia.com. Our featured patron is Jeremiah Friedley, author of Association, a core series prequel. When 15-year-old Kirsten's uncle is accused of attempted murder, she determines to help him clear his name of something she knows he didn't do. But soon she realizes she's not just fighting a false accusation, she's fighting a conspiracy to take down the social activist her uncle supports. And I will say the novel that follows this prequel that will be coming out soon, I hear, is a true dystopian. So I encourage you to check that out. You can read the prequel right now. The full novel will be out in a matter of weeks or months. And I just want to say, Jeremiah, thank you so much for being a patron. Thank you for your support that helps keep this podcast on the air. And a quick personal update. In this discussion about the Zeitgeist, we forgot to talk about romance books. And my little sister actually texted me recently. She's a big reader of romance books, and she asked me to pass along a message to romance authors. She's been a voracious reader forever, and she's never, in my over 10 years of doing this podcast, asked me to pass along a message to romance authors. And her message is this: to please stop having the girl save the guy. This totally ruins the books for her. It takes her out of the story altogether. She doesn't want to read about girl bosses. She doesn't want to read about damsels who rescue the man in distress. And this is something that probably deserves its own episode. It's very likely that in the fourth turning, we'll see a normalization in gender roles. Feminism was growing through the second and third turnings, and it's a very appealing philosophy during good times, but during a crisis, when there's a draft, suddenly feminism is a little less appealing. And there's an interesting anti-feminist movement already brewing amongst young women who feel that they've been sold a bill of goods. And if TikTok trends are anything to go with, feminist girl bosses are on their way out, and the trad wife aesthetic is in. The dream of the young woman is shifting away from giving the best years of her life to a global megacorp and instead spending those most fertile years as a trad wife who cares for her own children in her own homestead. So it's not just a rejection of feminism, but also a rejection of that urban life. It's a very different turn. I don't know if this will take off and go mainstream, but I do know that it is gaining popularity on TikTok, which is where a lot of young women spend time. So just be aware of that as you're writing romances. The girl boss may not be as appealing in the future as it was in the past. So like I said, this deserves its own full episode. We may do that in the future if I can find a good guest on it. But I thought I'd pop in here and pass my sister's message along because, like I said, she's never asked me to tell authors something, but I get the impression she's very frustrated with the offerings of romance books right now. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. You can find the blog version of this episode at authormedia.com/438. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.